How do you force a larger army to give back ground in less than a week when it spent months trying to take it? And what does it mean when 10 settlements change hands so fast that the entire southern front suddenly feels different? If you want clear war analysis without the fog, hit like, subscribe, and share this video with one friend who wants facts, pressure, and the bigger picture all in one place. For days, most eyes stayed fixed on the brutal fighting in the east. That is where the loudest headlines usually come from. Burning villages, shattered streets, constant artillery, and the same grim question repeated over and over again: who is still moving forward, and at what cost? But while attention remained locked on one part of the map, something quieter and far more dangerous for Moscow appears to have unfolded in the south. In just 168 hours, reports from the Ukrainian side described a sudden collapse of Russian forward positions on a key stretch of the southern front. The claim was dramatic. More than 10 settlements were said to have been liberated. Russian troops were reported to have fallen back roughly 10 kilometers on a sector where they had spent about 2 months pushing forward. If true, this was not just another local clash. It was a violent shift in tempo. That is why this story matters. This was not simply about a few tree lines, a handful of trenches, or dots on a battlefield map. It was about initiative. In war, territory matters, but timing matters even more. One army can lose ground and recover if it still controls the rhythm. But when it loses the rhythm, when it is no longer choosing the pace, the direction, or even the moment of retreat, then the damage goes deeper than the map can show. And that is the heart of this story. Ukraine did not just try to hit Russian positions. It appears to have hit the system that allowed those positions to stay alive. According to the accounts surrounding this operation, the pressure built over time. Russian forces had been grinding forward for months, trying to keep Ukrainian units stretched, exhausted, and reactive. Then the pattern broke. Instead of waiting behind defensive lines, Ukrainian forces began to punch back with speed, precision, and surprising coordination. Assault groups moved, drones hunted, supply routes came under pressure, rear areas stopped feeling safe, small cracks opened, then those cracks widened fast. A spokesperson for Ukraine's southern defense forces described the fighting as difficult but successful. The message was blunt. Russian attempts to keep pushing were repelled. Counterattacks were underway. Several Russian units were said to have lost the ability to continue offensive action. That last point is crucial. There is a difference between taking losses and losing function. Armies can absorb casualties. What they struggle to survive is the loss of coherence. That is what seems to have happened here. The most striking claim was the speed. Russian troops were reportedly forced to abandon around 10 kilometers of ground that had taken them roughly 60 days to secure. Ukraine, in other words, was said to have erased weeks of Russian effort in 1 week. Not symbolically, physically, on the ground. That kind of reversal does not happen because one attack went well. It happens when several pressures land at once, and each one makes the others more painful. Think of it like a door being kicked from 3 sides at the same time. The defenders are trying to hold the front. Then their supplies start failing. Then their movement gets watched from above. Then the routes behind them become dangerous. Then river lines and crossing points stop protecting them and start trapping them. Suddenly, a position that looked solid on paper becomes impossible to keep in real life. The reports from this sector suggest exactly that kind of chain reaction. At the center of the ground assault was said to be the 225th Separate Assault Regiment, operating near the Huliai-Pol area. The name matters less than the method. Ukrainian assault teams reportedly cleared Russian positions in villages that had been used as launch pads and pressure points. These were not random locations. Small settlements on this front often act as anchors. They are places where troops hide, observe, store ammunition, stage attacks, and force the enemy to keep watching every road and every tree belt nearby. Once those places are lost, the line does not just shrink, it starts to wobble. In one of the close-range fights described in the reporting, Ukrainian soldiers were said to have pushed directly into Russian positions and taken a number of prisoners alive. Footage from the operation was presented as evidence that surrendered troops were spared and evacuated. On one level, that is a moral detail. On another level, it also says something about confidence. Units that can secure prisoners in the middle of a fast-moving assault are often units that believe the local fight is under control. What made these attacks especially dangerous was the way they were coordinated with drones. The description from the front was not of infantry simply charging ahead. It was of assault groups moving under the cover of precise unmanned support. Drone teams identified weak points, struck exposed positions, and opened approach corridors for infantry. In areas where Russian electronic warfare coverage was weak, Ukrainian drones reportedly worked with deadly efficiency. That matters because modern battlefield movement is not just about bravery anymore. It is about visibility. If you can be seen, followed, and struck at any moment, your trench is no longer a shield. It is a marker over your head. So when a defending force cannot reliably block drones, every meter of ground becomes more expensive to hold. This may be the biggest lesson from the operation. It was not only an infantry story, it was a systems story. Another Ukrainian assault formation, the 475th Independent Assault Regiment, was also described as a major factor. Their edge reportedly came from intelligence and from heavy use of fiber optic controlled drones. That detail may sound technical, but its battlefield meaning is simple. In an environment full of jamming and signal disruption, these drones can remain effective because they are far harder to cut off in the same way as standard radio-controlled systems. That gives attacking units something priceless: reliability. Before ground forces moved, Russian supply vehicles in the sector were reportedly targeted and hit. Then attention shifted to troops dug into wooded areas and trench networks. Those positions were not just shelled and left alone. They were flushed out, cleared, and rolled back. By the end of that phase, key positions that Russia had reportedly been preparing for future operations were said to be back in Ukrainian hands. Read that again in strategic terms. If the reporting is accurate, this was not just a defensive save. It may have wrecked the foundation of a future Russian push in that part of the south. That would explain why the operation felt so disruptive. It did not merely stop movement. It reversed the logic of the sector. There was also mention of the 33rd Separate Assault Regiment clearing Russian forces from a village where enemy troops had entered homes and urban structures. Urban fighting is slow, personal, and brutal. Every room is a decision. Every doorway is a threat. So when a unit can clear buildings under drone-supported conditions and still keep moving, it tells you that the attackers are operating with a high level of preparation and trust. Then came the paratroopers. Ukraine 82nd and 95th Airborne Brigades were reportedly brought in from another active area and inserted into the offensive line east of Zaporizhzhia. That is not a small choice. Airborne units are often used where speed matters, where gaps must be exploited before the enemy can seal them, and where mobility creates opportunities heavier formations cannot take in time. If regular assault troops open the wound, airborne troops can widen it before the body reacts. That appears to be the logic here. Light armor, fast movement, and elite training made these brigades particularly useful in exploiting ruptures in Russian defenses. Their presence added depth to the counteroffensive and increased pressure on Russian command. Once fast-moving units begin to appear in places they were not expected, fear spreads faster than facts. A soldier does not need to see the whole battlefield collapse. He only needs to believe he might be cut off, and that belief can move men backward faster than orders can move them forward. Now, if you are finding this breakdown useful, save this video for later, subscribe so you do not miss the next frontline shift, and send it to someone who likes analysis that goes beyond the headline and into the mechanism. The story did not stop at the front edge of the assault. That is another reason this episode stands out. Ukrainian pressure reportedly extended into the rear, into the spaces that keep combat units alive. On open steppe terrain, Russian forces were said to be using light vehicles such as all-terrain machines and fast transport platforms for movement, infiltration, and evacuation. These vehicles may be useful when speed is the goal, but on a battlefield saturated with first-person view drones, speed alone is no guarantee of safety. A Ukrainian drone hunting team identified in the reporting as Iron Falcon was described as especially effective in tracking and destroying these mobile targets. The point is not the unit name. The point is the pattern. Russia tried to use mobility to reduce exposure. Ukraine used drones to turn mobility into visibility. Once that happens, the vehicle that was supposed to save you becomes the very thing that gives you away. This is one of the cruelest changes in modern war. The machine that makes movement possible can also make death easier to find. And then came the deeper strikes. A special operations element referred to as the Requiem Group within Ukraine ballista structure was described as focusing on convoys carrying fuel, ammunition, and personnel. The reported tactic was sharp and simple. Reconnaissance drones tracked convoy movement. Strike drones hit the front and rear vehicles, trapping the rest in the middle. Once immobilized, the convoy became a line of burning targets or abandoned cargo. This kind of attack does more than destroy supplies. It attacks confidence. Drivers become nervous. Dispatchers hesitate. Commanders start moving smaller loads on worse roads at worse times. Deliveries slow down. Fuel arrives late. Ammunition gets rationed. Reinforcements show up tired, scattered, or not at all. Little by little, the frontline soldier begins to feel what he cannot see. The rear is failing him. That is why logistics is never just about trucks. It is about trust. One of the most damaging reported effects involved fuel tankers. Mechanized forces can tolerate many things, but they cannot improvise fuel. Without it, armor becomes static. Without it, withdrawal becomes panic. Without it, even a planned repositioning can turn into a jam of stranded vehicles waiting for help that may never come. If that pressure was really happening at the same time that assault troops and airborne units were advancing, then Russian forces in the sector were facing a brutal choice. Hold forward positions while resupply gets worse, or pull back before the line snaps completely. The reporting suggests many chose the second option. Open-source loss estimates mentioned in the account painted an ugly picture for Russia. In a narrow sector and within roughly a week, Russian losses were described as including more than a dozen tanks, over 20 armored combat vehicles, and highly valuable electronic warfare systems that are far harder to replace than ordinary metal. Even if the financial estimates attached to those losses are rough, the operational meaning is clear. Losing a tank hurts. Losing the specialized gear that protects formations from drones can be worse, because it invites the next wave of damage. And this is where battlefield economics become battlefield psychology. A soldier hearing that a tank was destroyed may shrug and keep going. A soldier learning that the systems meant to blind enemy drones are gone may start looking up every few seconds. He starts to feel naked. That feeling changes how he fights, how he rests, and how quickly he breaks. While these setbacks were reportedly unfolding, Russian information channels were also described as trying to counter the story with staged signs of progress, including a claimed flag raising in a so-called gray zone rather than in the settlement itself. Whether that exact incident unfolded as described or not, the larger pattern is familiar. When battlefield reality turns bad, symbolic images become more valuable. A flag in the right camera frame can temporarily do the emotional work that the army can no longer do on the ground. But symbols have limits. A staged image cannot reopen a supply road. It cannot refuel a vehicle. It cannot pull a trap platoon across a river under drone fire. And it cannot hide the strategic meaning of losing terrain near a logistics hub. That hub, according to the account, was Pology. Once Ukrainian forces pushed forward, the city was said to be drawn closer to the effective range of 155mm artillery. That changes everything around it. A rail station that was useful last week becomes dangerous this week. Ammunition unloading points have to move farther back. Truck routes grow longer. Every extra kilometer adds time, risk, fuel use, and more chances for drones to strike. This is how a 10-kilometer retreat can create effects far larger than 10 kilometers. On paper, the distance may sound small. On a logistics map, it can be painful. On a command map, it can be alarming. And on a soldier map, the one carried in his head, it can feel enormous. Because the question is no longer only where the front line is. The question becomes what is now exposed behind it. That exposure may also help explain reports that Russian air defense assets in Crimea were being moved with growing urgency. If the southern front becomes more unstable, then every layer behind it has to think differently. Crimea is not just a symbol in this war. It is a military platform, a supply base, and a political promise wrapped into one. Any shift that makes routes to and from Crimea feel less secure carries meaning far beyond one local breakthrough. So why did Russian defenses struggle so badly here, at least according to these reports? Part of the answer seems to be command failure. The units named in the account included experienced formations from the southern grouping, including elements associated with Marine infantry and combined arms structures. These were not supposed to be soft troops, yet experience alone does not guarantee performance. If units are tired, undersupplied, badly positioned, or forced to defend with poor coordination, their reputation stops mattering the moment pressure lands. Another part of the answer is terrain and timing. The same river lines that may have helped Russia shape its defense were said to become a serious problem once Ukrainian forces crossed and pressure increased. Rivers can protect a flank. They can also choke a retreat. Bridges and crossing points suddenly become survival points. Lose control of them, and a planned withdrawal becomes a dangerous funnel. Everyone wants to pass through the same narrow spaces at the same time, often while being watched by drones and threatened by artillery. That is how order turns into vulnerability. And once observation points are taken on favorable ground, the attackers gain another advantage. They can watch movement, direct fire, and force the retreating side to keep moving under constant stress. Soldiers in that situation do not rest well. Drivers do not move confidently. Officers struggle to reassemble a stable line when every road feels observed. That is why speed matters so much in a counteroffensive. The first blow shocks, the second disorients, the third makes recovery feel impossible. There was also a technological layer to this reported success that deserves attention. Ukrainian cyber forces were described as collecting identity information and terminal coordinates connected to Russian attempts to reactivate battlefield communication systems, including Starlink terminals. Data packets were reportedly passed to Ukrainian agencies, and some terminals were said to have been disabled or bricked. If that account is accurate, it is another reminder that modern war is not fought only in trenches, villages, and roads. It is also fought in networks. A soldier can have ammunition, a weapon, and a trench, yet still become half-blind if communication fails. Once units start repairing cables by hand in a combat zone because their usual tools no longer work, something deeper than bad luck is happening. The battlefield is no longer just contested, it is being disconnected. That matters because communication is the nervous system of any army. Break enough of it, and even brave men move like damaged limbs. By this point in the operation, if we follow the reporting, the pattern becomes hard to miss. Ukrainian units did not win only by pushing harder at one point. They appear to have created overlapping forms of pressure. Drones from above, assaults at the edge, airborne exploitation in the gaps, rear strikes against supplies, fire control over roads, pressure on communication, fear around crossing points. That is what turns retreat from a choice into a necessity. And that is why the phrase "forced to retreat" carries weight here. A retreat is not automatically a collapse. Sometimes it is smart, sometimes it saves a force. But when it happens after supply lines are cut, after observation is lost, after positions are cleared, and after momentum has shifted, it becomes a public confession that the battlefield is no longer obeying your plan. If this kind of clear, no-nonsense storytelling helps you see the war more sharply, drop a like right now, subscribe before you forget, and share this video with the person who always asks what actually happened there. There is also a wider human meaning to this story that is easy to miss if we focus only on arrows and equipment counts. Every settlement in a frontline zone is more than a dot on a map. It is a place where people lived normal lives before war turned homes into cover and roads into danger. So when reports say 10 settlements were liberated in less than a week, that is also a reminder that 10 communities were dragged through another violent turn in this war. But liberation is not peace. Mines remain, homes may be damaged, the enemy may strike again. People who survive occupation often step into freedom carrying fear with them. That is why even good news on a battlefield comes with a shadow. Ukraine now faces the hard part. Taking ground is one challenge, holding it is another. New lines must be fortified, mines cleared, troops rotated, and supply routes secured while Russia looks for a way to hit back. Russia still has options. It can regroup, shell new positions, target crossings, and use propaganda while searching for weakness elsewhere. So this week, dramatic as it was, does not finish the story. For Ukraine, a sharp success in the south tells soldiers that Russian pressure is not unstoppable. It tells allies that support can still produce visible results. And it tells Moscow that focusing on one front does not make the others safe. In a war full of fatigue, even a local reversal can feel like oxygen. For Russia, the emotional effect may be far worse than the map suggests. Tired troops now have to wonder where the next blow will land. Commanders have to ask whether this was one bad week or proof of a deeper weakness. Logisticians face longer routes under greater danger. And frontline soldiers have to live with the thought that the sky above them may never stop watching. That kind of uncertainty is corrosive. It erodes an army in small moments. A driver waits. A squad leader delays movement. A commander holds back reserves. An artillery battery shifts farther back and loses speed. Together, those choices can thin a defense until the next blow lands harder than the first. That is why this story may prove more important than the simple number of liberated settlements suggests. If this retreat really reflects a wider failure in Russian command, logistics, and adaptation, then the Southern Front is no longer a quiet side issue. It becomes a test of method. Can Ukraine keep turning drones, mobility, and intelligence into repeated local shocks? And can Russia adapt fast enough to stop those shocks from spreading into a larger crisis behind the line? Those are the questions worth watching now. The deeper question is whether this was a one-week surprise or the early sign of a repeatable pattern. Because if it is a pattern, then every Russian commander in that sector is doing harsh math tonight. How many roads are still safe? How many fuel trucks can move by day? How many trenches are visible from above? How many bridges can be trusted if another retreat begins? How many soldiers still believe the line ahead of them will hold tomorrow? War looks loud from far away. Up close, it is often made of quiet questions like these. Maybe that is the most important part of the Zaporizhzhia story. For months, Russia tried to make Ukraine react, absorb pressure, and survive. Then, in less than a week, the pressure appears to have reversed direction. Russia was suddenly the side reacting. Russia was patching holes, shifting assets, explaining losses, and trying to control the story after losing control of the moment. That is not a final victory, but it is a real shift. And shifts matter because wars are not won by noise alone. They are won when one side keeps creating more problems than the other side can solve. In this reported operation, Ukraine seems to have created battlefield, logistics, communication, command, and psychological problems at the same time. That is far more dangerous than a simple attack. So when people hear 10 settlements in 168 hours, they should hear more than speed. They should hear what that speed was built on. Preparation, coordination, drone pressure, fast assault work, airborne mobility, rear area disruption, and the ability to turn Russian overreach into Russian retreat. That is why this story echoed so loudly, even though it unfolded away from the noisiest front. And it is why this week may become the beginning of a larger fight over the South. If Ukraine holds these gains, protects its new positions, and keeps Russian supply routes under pressure, the effects could keep spreading. If Russia stabilizes, repairs its logistics, and adjusts its defense, this week may be remembered as a sharp warning rather than a turning point. Right now, nobody honest can promise what comes next. But this much is clear. For 1 week on the Southern Front, the balance changed. The army that thought it was pressing found itself retreating. The side expected to absorb pressure generated it instead. And the map, for a moment, bent in Ukraine's favor. That is why this matters. Not because it ends the war, but because it proves that even in a brutal conflict, momentum can still be seized. And when momentum changes hands, the future changes with it. That is the part every general fears, every soldier feels, and every viewer should remember. In war, the most dangerous moment is not always the loudest one. Sometimes it is the moment when one side suddenly realizes the ground beneath its plan is gone. And in the South, for Russia, that may be exactly what this week was.